the expectation of war when it broke out in 1914. Everyone went to war. All the belligerent nations in Europe went to war, thinking this is going to be a quick, glorious war. Our men will be coming home with medals pinned on their chests and pretty girls throwing flowers at them. And of course, our side is going to win. Every belligerent nation thought that their side was going to win. Only one side could be the ultimate victor, but everyone expected a quick victory, and it would be a relatively painless war. Certainly we'll lose a few heroes along the way, and there'll be some men wounded in action, but it's going to be relatively easy, light casualties, few fatalities, and again, our side is obviously going to win. That's what everyone was told. That's the war they expected. It was not the war they got. The war they got turned out to be a war of attrition that chewed up millions of lives, not a few hundred, but millions of lives, and it involved the trench warfare that you see in the photo here, where men were just living in the mud, shooting each other, occasionally going over the top like these soldiers here to charge across no man's land, and they would be mowed down by the modern industrial weaponry of the First World War, led to enormous casualties that no one, or very few at least, saw coming, and turned the war into one of attrition. A war of attrition is one that's going to be finalized only when one side is so worn out they can no longer fight. And by 1918, that was the side of the Central Powers, Germany, Austria. They were by then so exhausted, so depleted of resources, they could no longer carry on the fight. And that's when the war ended. Now, the peace, of course, they had to settle peace. Peace conferences convened in 1919 in Paris to settle all the issues of the war, and that's a big subject. We don't have time to cover it exhaustively, but I will point out the main treaty to come out of the Paris Peace Conference dealt with Germany. It was the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles severely punished Germany for its role in the First World War. It took away a lot of territory, limited their army to only 100,000 men. They could have no air force, no very small navy. In other words, it was trying to demilitarize Germany for all practical purposes. Furthermore, Germany had to pay reparations to the victorious powers. In other words, pay the bill for the war, in essence. And Germany was forced to accept what was called the War Guilt Clause, taking full blame for the war. Needless to say, the Germans greatly resented this. Led to a lot of disillusionment. We finally have peace after this disastrous war that was so more destructive than anyone ever saw coming. And yet the peace led to a lot of disillusionment. How did that happen? We were the height of civilization, the Europeans thought, and yet there we were killing each other in the mud. What is wrong with our civilization? Led to a lot of disillusionment. That resentment of the Treaty of Versailles and that disillusionment with peace helped to lead to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany. About 1933, Adolf Hitler taking over as the leader of Germany. Again, that's a big subject. We don't have time to go into all the details, but suffice it to say, Nazi Germany was a system built on, first of all, a very virulently racist and anti-Semitic ideology, but also a system that believed that there were no real individual rights. Your right was to serve the state. It was a system that believed Germany had been treated very poorly by the Treaty of Versailles, and not only had to break out of the Versailles system, but had to capture a lot of territory in order to become the great nation Germany was destined to be. This was Nazi ideology in a very quick nutshell. And it led to a great deal of consternation over the rise of Nazi Germany and Hitler. What is Hitler going to do? Look at the map here. Here's Germany that existed in 1930s. They had lost territory, as I said. Austria has become a small Alpine nation, lost most of its empire. Germany had territory up here in Poland, or given to Poland. So that's called the Polish Corridor. And it was a situation that, again, the Nazi Party was not happy with. We'll be returning to this map quite a few times as we go along. And Germany's push for war, first of all, began with the idea that Hitler was not afraid of war. He was, in fact, actively seeking it in a lot of ways. He did not believe that a world war or a European war, if it broke out again, would be as destructive as the previous one. And he believed that Germany could win if a war broke out. And so he began, really before this, began building up his military in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. But one of his first really aggressive moves was the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Get back to the map. There we go. Okay, the Rhineland is this striped territory right here in the region between Germany and France. And under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not allowed to keep any sort of military fortification there, any weaponry, in the air base. Well, they weren't allowed to have an air force at all, but keep those soldiers there in the Rhineland. It was designed to be a buffer between Germany and France should war break out again. Hitler in 1935 announced we are going to remilitarize the Rhineland. We're moving troops in there. We're going to build fortifications because we can. And it doesn't matter that the treaty has violated this or prohibited this. We are going to turn our back on the Treaty of Versailles. We're moving troops into the Rhineland. So this was a violation of the treaty, and it led to a quandary. What do we do about this for Britain and France? How do we respond to the German remilitarization of the Rhineland? Britain and France were not quite sure how to respond to this. On the one hand, they wanted the Treaty of Versailles to be followed and upheld, but at the same time, they weren't really ready to do anything about it. And neither was Germany, ironically. This was not really known until years later. But the German army was not really ready for a fight at that point anyway. When German troops marching into the Rhineland, there were newsreel footage of them towing big artillery pieces. What no one knew and could tell from the newsreels, they weren't real artillery. They were dummies or telephone poles and artillery carriages. So if Germany and or Britain and France had decided to do something about it at that point in 1935, Germany really would have been in sad shape. And a lot of historians believe that this was the best chance to stop Hitler with the remilitarization of the Rhineland. If Britain and France had presented a united front and a military response to this, possibly they could have prevented what's going to come in the next few years. But they didn't, because Britain and France had a decision to make, and the policy they decided to follow instead of responding forcefully to Germany was the policy of appeasement. Now, appeasement goes down in history as a bad word. No one, if you accuse someone of being an appeaser, usually you're not paying them a compliment. And yet, in the 1930s, appeasement didn't have those negative connotations. This was considered to be a legitimate chance at keeping the peace. And you kind of see this if you think about your own experience. I bet some of you have been babysitters, some of you may be parents, and let's say you've got a 2-year-old screaming at home that he wants another cookie. What's the easiest thing to do? It's just to give him a cookie, right? You're not going to fight over this. You want to get the screaming stopped, and so you give him a cookie. Well, that's appeasement. In other words, it's giving concessions in order to keep the peace. And Britain and France decided this is how we're going to respond to the remilitarization of the Rhineland. We are going to appease Hitler by granting him that. We're not going to stop you from remilitarizing the Rhineland. However, that's it. We don't want you to do anything else after this. Hitler was always very careful to say after one of his aggressive moves that now I'm fully satisfied. He would act like he was appeased. Really, Hitler could not be appeased. He did not have any great desire for peace at all. And so every time he was appeased, it's just another step. He just wanted another cookie after that. And so appeasement, I say, goes down in history as a great failure, and it's become sort of a bad word. because ultimately it did fail. Spoiler alert, it doesn't prevent World War II. However, at the time, it was considered by some to be naive. We cannot appease Hitler, so why are we even trying? But others consider this a noble attempt to keep the peace. And then there's kind of a third option, some historians will say, which was that appeasement, if nothing else, bought some time. Britain and France were not ready for the next World War either, but this helped to give them time to build up their forces so that they would be within a few years. How you look at it, again, depends on how you want to look at all the evidence and draw your conclusions. But as I say, at the time, it was not considered to be such a naive thing. It was considered by many people to be the proper course. But as you already know, it did not stop Hitler. So what goes on over the next couple of years is the world seems to be taking sides. It begins falling into place. 1935, also same year as the remilitarization of the Rhineland, Italy invaded the African nation of Ethiopia in a bid to expand their empire. And this is not widely remembered in the United States, but it was one of the steps to the war. Prior to this, Italian invasion, Italy and Germany had been somewhat at odds. They were a little antagonistic toward each other. But this and the international response to the Ethiopian crisis led the Italian leader Mussolini, who's pictured right there next to Hitler, led him to begin moving closer to Hitler's orbit. And Hitler was only too glad to welcome another ally. 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain. And once again, I don't have time to go into all the details of why this happened and how it happened, but let's just say this was in many ways World War I and a half. The Spanish Civil War was a conflict that drew in, on one side, supporters of the Soviet Union. On the other side, the Spanish forces that were backed by Hitler and Mussolini, Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And the Western democracies, they stayed out of it. They said, we will be neutral in the Spanish Civil War, except for a few volunteers who went to fight, such as Ernest Hemingway. However, this did not lead to the Second World War directly, but it did foreshadow a lot of the ideological patterns of the war. It did foreshadow some of the military tactics and weaponry that's going to be used in the Second World War. And that's why I call it World War I and a half. Certainly a step closer to war, even if it was not a war itself. It also helped to bring Italy and Germany closer together. There was one other aggressive power in the world, and that was Japan. And again, we're talking about the start of the war in Europe, really, so we don't say a whole lot about Japan. But they also wanted to expand their territory, upset the international status quo. And this was enough to bring into an alliance called the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis, or just the Axis, those three nations, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, signed this, for all intents and purposes, a military alliance in 1937 known as the Axis. President Franklin Roosevelt in the United States called them the three bandit nations, and that they were now aligned to keep fighting against the status quo and bringing us closer to the war. Next big step, and I will say, if you read a more in-depth book, you'll see there are more steps than we're covering today. This is sort of a selective list. But the next big one came in 1938, with what was called the Anschluss. That is just a German word for annexation, and refers in 1938 to the German annexation of Austria. Austria had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire prior to World War I, had been a big force in Eastern Europe. But it collapsed at the end of World War I, so that all that was left was Austria. It was not a big empire, but the small nation, populated mainly by German-speaking peoples. And one of the Nazi ideas was that all of the German-speaking people should be in one nation. And therefore, he pushed for the annexation of Austria. Hitler actually was born in Austria, not in Germany. And so he began pushing for this and pressuring the Austrians. And in 1938, moved his troops in to annex Austria, forcing once again a violation of the Treaty of Versailles. This was not what the Paris Peace Conference had designed for the map. Also was considered to be very threatening because that took all the population of Austria and added them to the population of Germany, which means they would be able to field a bigger army if war did break out. Britain and France now had another decision to make. What do we do? How do we respond to this? And the answer was, once again, appeasement. We're going to appease Hitler and let him have that cookie to keep the peace and keep from going to war. So appeasement continues on with the Anschluss. And one reason for this was that soon after the annexation, the Austrians got together and voted in a big plebiscite, a big election, basically, to say yes or no, we want to be part of Nazi Germany. And the Anschluss was endorsed overwhelmingly by the Austrian people. Now, was it a fair election? No. Nazi Germany was a totalitarian state. Fair elections were not exactly part of their equation. However, it did give a little cover to appeasement, because the British and the French could say, what are we supposed to do? We can't oppose the will of the Austrian people, and they want to be annexed to Germany. And so they appease this move as well. In retrospect, of course, there wasn't a whole lot Britain and France could do about this. While they had respectable militaries, it was nowhere near Austria. And today, of course, if we want military force, somewhere in the world, we can get it there in 24 hours. That wasn't the case in 1938. The British and the French armies, certainly the British Navy, which is not going to do much good in Austria, but these things, they could not be moved so rapidly. And so what are they going to do to protect Austria? Nothing. Appeasement really becomes the order of the day once again. So let's look at the map now and notice what has just happened, right? So here's Germany. There's their border. And now they've added to their border Austria, right? And so you look at where the border of Germany now lies with Austria annexed, and you see that suddenly the nation of Czechoslovakia is right there in the grasp of Nazi Germany. And it doesn't surprise a lot of people that despite the fact that, after appeasement, Hitler always says, now I'm fully satisfied. I want nothing else. I will be happy to endorse the status quo. Doesn't take very long until Hitler begins to pressure the Czechoslovakians for some concessions, and especially in this region right here on the border known as the Sudetenland. And so this leads in 1938 to the Sudetenland crisis. Now, the Sudetenland was this border region between Czechoslovakia, fairly new nation, and Nazi Germany. It was primarily a German-speaking region. It's part of the Czech nation, but it was a lot of German-speaking people there who associated themselves with Germany culturally. Hitler began to pressure Czechoslovakia to cede the Sudetenland to Germany because, remember, all the German people should be in one state, Hitler said. Czechoslovakia was a small nation, didn't have a great deal of power. The fortifications it had were really in the Sudetenland, so by giving away that territory, they'd be giving away their defenses for all practical purposes. As Hitler pressured Czechoslovakia to cede him the Sudetenland, the response was another international crisis. And how do Britain and France respond to this? What do they do? France was an ally of Czechoslovakia, for instance. So how do we respond to this? The answer was to call an international conference in Munich to settle this idea around the bargaining table rather than on the battlefield. Let's get together with the main powers involved, Nazi Germany, obviously, Britain, France, and Mussolini from Italy, coming in as sort of an arbiter as well. And we will discuss what happens. Notice who was not invited to have a say at the Munich conference was Czechoslovakia, nor was the Soviet Union, which was watching all this with a great deal of growing alarm. But at the Munich conference, after the discussions and the diplomacy, the British and the French announced that Hitler will be allowed to annex the Sudetenland as long as it's done peacefully. And as long as that's it, he doesn't want anything else, no more cookies. Hitler was absolutely delighted to accept this deal. He annexed the Germanic-speaking Sudetenland, which meant he moved past the Czech border defenses, leaving Czechoslovakia pretty much undefended. And this was is considered by many historians to be the absolute depths of appeasement, when they allowed the Sudetenland to be given away without the Czechs really even having a whole lot to say in the matter. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, went back to London, got off his airplane, and stood there and waved in the air a copy of the Munich Agreement with the ink still, damp on the page. And he proclaimed that this means peace in our times. We have just prevented a war. There will be peace in our times. Well, our time is only going to last about 11 months after this, but that shows the intention of appeasement was to keep the peace. And Britain and France believed that was very important, because remember what war is to them. It's World War I. That's what they're trying to avoid. They don't want to see their boys dying in the trenches again just 20 years after the war had ended. They want to avoid that at all costs. Hitler has no such reservations about war. He is ready to fight a war, and peace in our time. Just what he wants is really just appeasement for another step, and he gets it. So the Sudeten crisis moves us even closer to war, but avoids a war for 1938 until 1939 in March, when Hitler annexed the rest of Czechoslovakia. This probably didn't come as a surprise to a lot of people. Remember that the Czech border defenses had been pretty much wiped out by the Sudetenland annexation. And so this was a very clear violation, not only of the Treaty of Versailles, but also of the spirit of Munich. The idea of the Munich Conference was, we're going to give Hitler what he wants to keep the peace, but that's it. No more aggressive moves. Didn't last long before Hitler is moving into Czechoslovakia. This was, again, not only a violation of the spirit of Munich, but also of everything Hitler had done up to this point, which had been to bring the Germans into his German fatherland. He could say, under the principle of self-determination, that all the Germans should be in one nation, that we are going to bring the Austrians and the Sudeten Germans into what he called his Reich, the Third Reich. The Czechs were not Germans, nor were the Slovaks. They were Czechs and Slovaks, obviously. And so this was just naked aggression. Nothing could justify it. And at this point, finally, appeasement stops. Britain and France draw a line in the sand and say, if you take one more aggressive move, it will mean war. Now, that doesn't help the Czechs much. There's nothing the British and French can do to stop the invasion of Czechoslovakia, because, again, their troops are nowhere near Czechoslovakia. It can't be moved that quickly. But now they draw the line in the sand and say, that's it. No more aggressive moves, or we will go into war. Now, what does Hitler think about this? Why does he believe them? Why should he believe them? They have been giving him cookies for years now. And so he has every reason to believe they are just another step toward appeasement. They're not going to really go to war. Hitler doesn't fear war. He doesn't believe war is really going to come, because he doesn't think Britain and France are going to do anything but appease him forever. But if there is going to be a war, Hitler knew that it could not be fought on two fronts. So let's go back to the map now. The border now goes right along here, right? Not hard to see where Hitler's next move is going to be into Poland. Hitler doesn't really even try to disguise this very much. Everyone knows the next battleground, if Hitler continues his aggressive ways, is going to be Poland. And if Hitler moves into Poland, he understands that Britain and France might declare war. They've said they would. Well, will they? That's another matter. But they've said they might declare war. But that's a problem, because Poland was also considered to be desirable territory by the Soviet Union. And so if we go to war with Britain and France, fighting over here in the Rhineland, what happens if Soviet Union attacks us through Poland? which is pretty much what had happened in the First World War when we were fighting Britain and France over here, and the Americans eventually, and the Russians over here, two-front war. And that's really what a lot of Germans believed lost us the First World War. In fact, we were fighting on two fronts. So Hitler thinks, I want to invade Poland. That's the next logical move for us to invade Poland, but I cannot risk a two-front war. And so what do we do about this? Well, the answer was to come to terms with the Soviet Union, with what is called the Nazi-Soviet Pact. In August of 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed this non-aggression pact to stay at peace with each other, and some trade concessions, some other agreements in there. What no one knew for years, though, we sort of suspected based on what the headlines are going to be in a few weeks, but what no one knew was that there were actually secret clauses in the Nazi-Soviet Pact that divided up Poland. Hitler said, in essence, I will take this portion of Poland, and the Soviet Union can, without us complaining or doing anything about it, can take that portion of Poland, which had been Russian territory prior to World War I. And so this was against secret protocols, but it deserves to be remembered, and often isn't. Soviet Union will be our ally in World War II, and a very important ally, I might add. But they were also one of the aggressors leading to the outbreak of the war in 1939. And with the Nazi-Soviet Pact, this paved the way for the war. Hitler could now invade Poland. Again, not entirely convinced that Britain and France actually will declare war, but if they do, it won't be a two-front war. And that was a security for Hitler that he greatly prized, the fact that he can now move into Poland without worrying about fighting a two-front war, even if it meant giving away part of the Polish territory to the Soviet Union. Well, that's fine. We will not have a two-front war, and we will have expanded our borders. This is what paved the way to war, and the ink on the Nazi-Soviet Pact is barely dry when on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And this is considered to be the start of World War I, in Europe at least. To be fair, I should point out that over in the Pacific, in Asia, Japan had invaded China and been fighting the Chinese since 1937. And so if you ask the Chinese people when did World War I begin, they don't say September 1st, 1939. But for Europe, at least, this was the beginning of the war. Technically, it took a couple of days. Britain and France declared war, as they had said, after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. They did follow through, no appeasement of this one. They declared war on Germany on September 3rd. That does pretty much no good whatsoever for the Poles. There's nothing that the British and the French military can do to help the Poles, and Poland is indeed overrun within a matter of a few weeks. And at the same time, the Soviets moved into their territory that they claimed under the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And soon after this, Poland disappears from the map until 1945. And the Polish people are going to suffer greatly, both at the hands of the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But this gets World War I underway in Europe. That's where we're holding it right now. But just to sum up what's going to come in the next few years, the most destructive war anyone had ever imagined. A war that's going to begin with horsed cavalry charges on the plains of Poland, much like Napoleon had experienced. That's where the war starts. It ends with atomic bombs. It's going to see not just some battlefields in Europe, but the entire world engulfed in combat. It's going to take 6 years and a day from September 1st, 1939 to sort it all out. And it's going to cost 40 to 50 million dead, an enormous toll that no one could have imagined. And this is how it happened, at least in the European theater. So what went wrong? Why did this war break out? Well, again, you can read 100 history books and get 100 different opinions from historians. But some of the factors I think most of us would agree on what led to this. First of all, some of the factors leading to the outbreak of war in 1939, a failure to build a lasting peace in 1918. When the First World War ended and Germany was forced to accept this Treaty of Versailles that punished them so heavily, this almost certainly led to, it was inevitable, it's going to lead to resentment on the part of the Germans and try to get out of this treaty uh, as soon as they can. And that the only way they were going to be able to do that was through warfare. Unfortunately, in retrospect, at least that seemed to be true. So had they done a little better job of building the peace in 1918, yeah, maybe they could have avoided the war in 1939. But also, many historians would credit the failure of the British and the French to discourage Nazi aggression in the 1930s, the appeasement process. This was considered to be a mistake by many people. Again, that's why today, if you say appeasement, you're usually not paying someone a compliment. Had Britain and France stood up to aggression in the 1930s at, for instance, the remilitarization of the Rhineland, had they told Hitler, we will not tolerate all of these aggressive moves, maybe things would have been different. But again, we don't know because it didn't happen that way. But another important point to remember is that the Nazi ideology of Adolf Hitler did not embrace peace anyway. He did not fear war. He was pursuing it. He believed that war was a way to bring back the greatness of the German nation. And given that ideology, which was beyond just wanting more territory, it was also, remember, so virulently totalitarian and anti-Semitic and racist in many other ways. It was an ideology that really had to be stopped. Many decisions could have been made differently in the 1930s, in 1918 or the 1930s, to stop the rise of Nazi Germany or to stop their expansion. But realistically, ultimately, this was a nation that really had to be stopped one way or the other. And so the war, it's hard to say historically anything is inevitable because, we don't know what might have happened if things had happened differently because they only happened one way. But it was certainly, looking back, it's hard to escape the thought that this was a war that eventually was going to be fought one way or the other because Nazi Germany simply had to be stopped. There were two visions of the world at play here, one in which Nazi Germany took over Europe and one in which they did not. And which of those two was preferable, not hard to figure that out, given what we know about the coming years. And so World War II breaks out. It's going to be devastating, but it's ultimately going to lead at least to the positive outcome of the destruction of Nazi Germany, the elimination of fascist Italy, the stop aggressive moves of Imperial Japan, and if nothing else, World War II will create a better world in that regard. Okay, I will hold it there. And I don't know, Maggie, if you have any questions that have come up. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to.
Well, I'm going to switch real quick here. If you have any questions, go to the bottom of your screen. You'll see a button that says Q&A. Click on that. You can type your question in there, and I'll read them to John, and John will respond. So feel free to do it there. Also, feel free to do it within the chat feature. It looks like a little text button with 3 dots too. So we have about 10 more minutes left for questions. It can be on anything about the lecture, anything you may be curious about with World War II, and we'll wrap up at about 10:45.
While we're waiting for some questions, let me point out another factor that was at play here. And the fact that Britain and France, they were expecting the war to be what World War I had been. They did not foresee the type of mobile war that Hitler would begin to fight with armor, with airplanes, covering vast amounts of territory. This was something that Hitler had been working on, the Nazi Germany had been working on for some time. But Britain and France, they were expecting the war to be the trench warfare of World War I. And the fact that that shaped their military plans. One reason they didn't try to stop Germans in Czechoslovakia or Poland, again, they not like they could move there so rapidly with the technology of 1938, 39. But another thing was that their entire war plan was based on the idea that the Germans will come to us, and then we will tie them up in trench warfare and stop them there. But we are not going on the offensive. We're going to wait until they attack us.
So the first question we had was the U.S. considered an isolationist country during this time?
Was the U.S. considered an isolationist country? And the answer is absolutely. The United States is watching all of this happen in Europe with a great deal of alarm, certainly. Roosevelt was even trying to, put out some peace feelers and offer to negotiate. President Franklin Roosevelt in the United States, of course. But the United States was not about to get involved in the affairs of Europe again. After World War I, the United States simply went back to being the United States over in its corner of the Western Hemisphere and was not interested. Well, they were interested, certainly, but they were not going to get involved in the affairs of Europe. And so while the American public, the Roosevelt administration, certainly looked on Nazi Germany as the bad guys in all this, for the most part, they were not going to commit forces. It's, of course, not going to be until 1941, 2 years into the war in Europe, that the United States will get involved with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, because Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy were allies of Japan. We end up declaring war on Japan, certainly because they attacked us at Pearl Harbor, but also Germany and Italy are going to declare war on the United States. And then we will set instantly our priority as Europe first. Our strategy will be to defeat Nazi Germany first, but most of our resources there before we go to fight in the Pacific. So the United States is definitely an isolationist state through the 1930s, but they were not neutral in the expansion of Nazi Germany. Good question. The United States also began to get involved, of course, while it's a neutral, from 1939 to 1941 with supplying the British and the French, and then France is going to be knocked out of the war in 1940, so then just the British. But they're going to begin the process of helping to supply them with policies like destroyers for bases, lend-lease that gives military goods and non-military goods to the British, and helps to supply them for the fight. And can we go back to the map? Trying to go back to the map and say another major factor in what's coming is, despite the Nazi-Soviet pact, here we go, despite the Nazi-Soviet pact that divided up Poland and was a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, in 1941, Hitler made what is considered by most historians to be his fatal mistake. He invaded the Soviet Union to try to claim all of this territory as well. That will not end well for Nazi Germany, to say the least. We think in the United States, of course, of our part in in the war. We think of D-Day. We think of the Americans fighting in the Pacific. We don't often think about what the Soviet Union is doing here. They are our ally, and they will not only kill many Nazi German soldiers, but they will lose millions of people themselves in order to secure the victory. Another question?
We do have another question. So, what do you think the motivations were for Japan to attack Pearl Harbor? And I think also a secondary question to that would be, what was the motivation of the Axis powers to get the United States involved?
Ideally, Germany would have been happy if the United States didn't get involved. Now, one thing that we are doing is shipping supplies across the Atlantic. So Nazi Germany is very concerned with that. They would like to seek those shipments with their submarines, but they don't want to do that and bring the United States into the war. That's one reason Nazi Germany does declare war on the United States after Pearl Harbor, was to be able to target our shipping. Why did Japan attack at Pearl Harbor in the first place? I don't have a Pacific map to show you here, But if you look it up, you will see that Japan is a small island nation that did not have a lot of resources. They considered that they needed to expand their territory to become a great state. Well, who's standing in the way of that expansion? Initially, it was Britain and France because they had a lot of territories in the Pacific, and they were, they were opposed to Japanese expansion. But once the war breaks out in Europe, Britain and France are too consumed with European affairs to worry about the Pacific much. So the other big power in the way of Japanese expansion was the United States, which had a presence in the Pacific, had Hawaii certainly, had the Philippines under American control, and this was a threat to the Japanese plans for expansion. And so one way for them that they deemed to be able to do this was to attack the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and make it impossible for us to fight a war in the Pacific. And so that's what happens, of course, December 7th, 1941. Japan was an ally of Italy and Germany, but the alliance really didn't mean Germany had to go to war since Japan was the aggressor. They're the ones who attacked. Germany and Italy just kind of followed along Germany. They declared war on the United States in order to target the shipping for was one of the major reasons. It's another thing that many people consider to be a mistake, the fact that Hitler declared war on the United States when he really didn't have to. Another good question.
Okay, we're coming up to the end of our program. Thank you guys for joining us today. Before we head out, I do have a few announcements for you guys. Our next program will be on Tuesday, March 24th at 10 o'clock. We're going to be talking about specifically D-Day and looking at the equipment that men would have carried with them on the beaches. It's very similar to what we do for our field trip programs, but it's going to be absolutely fascinating using lots of artifacts that were involved in World War II and some that were involved during the invasion itself. Last but not least, I want to let you guys know that while the memorial serves the nation's monument to D-Day, it is not a state or federally funded site. If you enjoyed this programming, we ask that you consider supporting our work at this critical time. And we greatly appreciate you guys tuning in and any type of contributions you're able to give. I've included a link to our website if you guys are interested in making a donation online. Again, thank you guys for joining today. We enjoyed this. I hope you guys did too. This recording will also go on our website for you to view again at a later time. So thank you guys for joining. We really appreciate it. We hope to see you guys next Tuesday at 10 o'clock too. Thanks.